Hey, it's Anita, and this is the Anita Posch Show. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the Anita Posch Show, where it is my pleasure to keep you up to date with topics around Bitcoin on a global stage and also the local impact it has on people like you and me. My guest today is Alex Gladstein. Alex is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. The Human Rights Foundation was founded in 2005, and Alex is a member of the team since 2007. We are going to talk about the role that Bitcoin can play in supporting the goals of the Human Rights Foundation, which are defending human rights and promoting liberal democracies all around the world. As always, you can listen to this podcast in your favorite podcast player. And with the Sphinx Chat app and the Breeze app, you can now even stream sats while you're listening to my podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to my podcast feed, and also, if you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the subscribe button now to subscribe to my channel. And as always, now a short message from my sponsors, and then enjoy. Many people worry about the right storage for their Bitcoin. And yes, holding them isn't always easy. The safest way is offline, physically. That's why Coinfinity developed the Card Wallet, the professional and easy solution. Order it now at cardwallet.com/Anita and get 20% off. Do you want to stay up to date with the things that happen in Bitcoin from my point of view? Then subscribe to Anita's Weekly, my newsletter with articles, videos, quotes, short tips on how to use Bitcoin and all that for free. Subscribe to Anita's Weekly at anita.link/weekly. Hello, welcome Alex Gladstein. Glad to have you on the show.
Happy to be here.
It's great that you found the time to do this interview with me because I think your mission aligns very much with my mission, why I'm here, why I'm in the Bitcoin space. Can you tell my audience a little bit about you? I've introduced you a little bit in the intro, but please tell them what did you do before you were the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation?
Well, that's basically been my whole career. I've been working at the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit in New York City that focuses on helping people who live under authoritarian regimes around the world. I've been there since 2007. So, it's been a long time. Since the pre-Bitcoin days, I've been working on how to promote freedom in different difficult places around the world through a lot of interesting programs. We did work at the beginning helping different kinds of foreign media, restricted media get into Cuba. We worked with the underground library movement there. I spent a lot of time in my career working with North Korean refugees and defectors, getting information into their country. We also spent a lot of time building up the Oslo Freedom Forum, which is a sort of a European annual conference that brings together dissidents with people from all industries. So, in my time at the Human Rights Foundation, I learned a lot about technology and how it could be used to empower, but also to repress. So that kind of led me to Bitcoin, that career path.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Yeah. Was this a long-term interest of yourself? Did you also when you were young already, have you been interested in human rights and these things, or why did you choose that path?
Yeah, actually, I was originally going to be an engineer. I enrolled in a university for engineering, but the Iraq War was very formative for me. I was in high school when we invaded Iraq, and in college in 2004, 5, 6, I shifted my focus to international relations. I wanted to learn more about why we did that. So that really colored a lot of my work from there, and I realized that there are a lot of folks around the world who weren't able to do what I was able to do, meaning be critical of my rulers and vote them out, etc. It led me to want to work on trying to expand human freedom as much as I could.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the Human Rights Foundation was only founded 2 years before. Did you hear about them and apply there, or how did this come together?
Yeah, I started with a summer internship, and then they gave me a job offer after that. So I started full-time in 2008, and it's been really fun ever since.
Since then, never looked back.
No,
was the right decision.
Totally.
And when you started in 2007, you already said it, that was pre-Bitcoin. Did you already dream about a financial tool that is uncensorable and globally usable?
No, I was not down the rabbit hole at all. Did not pay very much attention to finance or economics until really, probably closer to 2017. There were like rumblings that I encountered throughout my work in terms of people having a hard time getting money from one place to another. In fact, in 2013, that was the first time I got exposed to Bitcoin, was when some Ukrainian activists wrote to us and said, we want to see if we can, this was sort of right before the end of the year, right before 2014, right before the Russian invasion, and they were worried about the civil society movement, and they wanted to see if Bitcoin could be a tool for support. And we started accepting Bitcoin donations the next year in 2014, but I didn't really start to really dive in and understand it for a few years later. So that's one of the big issues or problems, is that the human rights industry or community, or whatever, however you want to put it, movement, doesn't think very critically about money and currency, where it comes from, how it works. And I'm an example of that. Like, again, I was like knee deep in it for a decade, and I mean, it just wasn't, it's not anywhere. It's not on conference agendas. It's not in the words of human rights activists who speak, like, it's just not there, right? There's some peripheral stuff, but it's not core. And now I've realized it's very core. So that's a big realization I've had in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And did you see other human rights foundations also recognize that now, or is this basically you? Is this you and the Human Rights Foundation alone in this space that are using and promoting Bitcoin?
I would say it's still pretty sparse. The other really large human rights organizations don't grok Bitcoin for sure. Like you can search the word. They don't write about it at all. I mean, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc. I could list 10 organizations. I don't think that they grasp either side of it. Like, right? So there's the ideological side of it where, it's this liberation tool, but there's also the administrative side of it. Like, as a nonprofit, you want to be raising money in Bitcoin. You want to be potentially building up Bitcoin on your balance sheet. You want to be using it administratively to move money from one country to another. Like, you could not believe in it at all, ideologically, and still find the value very high for administrative stuff. And those are the two areas that nonprofits are going to have to think about as we go into the Bitcoin world. And they're just not there yet on either side, right? On either side. However, there are a growing number of movements and activists and individuals who've completely grasped it. Absolutely. I mean, we are way past the early stages of that. In fact, just 2 days ago, an organization that we've worked with called Lucha in the Congo announced that they'd be accepting Bitcoin donations. That's a very large and significant, very well-known organization. I mean, they have 250,000 followers on Twitter. They are, incredibly brave, alliance of youth across this huge country of 80 million people, 90 million people who have had a problem raising money from abroad. and whose currency has been completely deprecated, wiped out. It's lost huge amounts of value over time. It still is massive double-digit inflation. So these people have issues kind of preserving value for their organizations and also receiving money abroad, and they have banking issues and all sorts of stuff. So as they're starting to get it now. It's pretty amazing. So very excited to work with them, to help them. Hopefully you'll see more news on that front soon. But I think it's just a matter of time before, all these, at-risk human rights movements start to realize how important Bitcoin's going to be for them. I think we're in the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see a huge shift there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're doing a lot of work here in promoting it on Twitter, and also when there were conferences. I always see you talking and writing about that topic. And at the moment, we see another FUD wave, with the big energy debate about Bitcoin. And I think it's a pity that mainstream media is reporting, in a way, false. I mean, it's true that it's a lot of electricity, but it's not. It has a good use. What do you say to those media people, or let's say, how can we get so much education out to the people that they don't hinder others to use it anymore?
We only got one shot with Bitcoin, right? It only happened once. It will only happen once. And, we won't be able to get a do-over. Can't do it. Can't create a new Bitcoin and then do it over again. And the mainstream media will always have to be called to account for essentially gaslighting their populations over the first decade of its use, where despite the fact that obviously Bitcoin is hugely useful to many people, and it's just this incredibly revolutionary, both kind of social construct, money, technology, whatever you want to call it, it's so clearly changing the world when you dig in and look at the data and understand the game theory and the geopolitics here. But all the major broadsheets, television stations, talking heads, at least up until the last few months especially, and still today obviously, but especially up until the middle of 2020, let's put it that way, for the first decade of Bitcoin's existence, the media just completely gaslit the public into thinking it was bad for terrorists, for criminals, bad for the environment, bad for you, a bad store of value, a bad, it's too volatile, too hard to use, and the government's going to ban it, right? So and there's more. Oh, it's reliant on Tether and all these other things, and the media would just constantly. And I studied this a little bit. I dove into one particular publication, Wired UK, right, which is a pretty prominent technology platform, and I looked at all of their Bitcoin coverage over the last 2 years. What they would do is, it was interesting. They did 18 pieces. 17 of which were very critical of Bitcoin, and one was a profile of the Winklevi, which, good for them, but it kind of gives you the impression that Bitcoin's for billionaires, right? It wasn't, let's put it this way, it wasn't super positive. That's a 0% open-minded rate, right? I mean, one thing would be if they had 3 articles that were showing how it's having a human impact, and then maybe 10 that weren't. Okay, fine, we could have a debate. But 0 is there's an agenda there, right? So when you're looking at stuff like that, you just realize that and then you start to think about the New York Times or the Economist or Deutsche Welle or whatever, and you start adding it all up, and you're like, oh my God, everybody's been completely fooled. I mean, they've been essentially, not lied to, lied to, but also just misled in a huge way, away from learning about it. Okay, and this trickles down to all aspects of our society, to schooling, education, to politicians, to practitioners, people, of course, in the human rights space. I mean, one of the reasons why human rights activists aren't realizing the power of Bitcoin is because they've been gaslit, right? So it's truly amazing to actually start to comprehend the scale of what's happened, and I'm just starting to unpack it now, and it's tough to look at. I mean, they really set us back. What can you say?
Do you think that they really have this agenda in their heads, or is it just because they perpetuate always the same stories?
I mean, look, I'm only 35, so I wasn't around for the beginning of the internet, right? I mean, I was around in as much as I was using my dial-up modem and playing games, and I knew it would change the world, even when people in the news were saying it was a fad. Like, I knew that was wrong, right? But if you go back in time, the Pessimist Archive, I don't know if you've seen this, it's a great resource on Twitter. They keep headlines going back 200 years, and they focus around innovations, right? So it's unfortunately not unique. Like, when electricity was invented, there was just massive hysteria about how it was bad for humans. When the car was invented, massive hysteria about how a horse was just way better. When the plane was invented, death machine. Radio, it's going to kill us all. Television, credit card, all of it. So every time there's a big new innovation, there is this conservative, inertia-led, Luddite, skeptical nature, which journalism feeds into, because journalists are supposed to be critical, right? You're supposed to be critical, like pointing out the thing. But it's kind of like the forest for the trees thing. Like, what I think has happened is that the Bitcoin thing has come up, and the journalists are focusing on, we need to criticize this thing. They don't realize that what they really need to criticize is what's all around them. That's been completely missing. So, people will like really drill down on like Bitcoin's energy use, and yet they won't talk about the fiat system's energy use. In fact, they show zero interest in that. And if you bring that up, you're changing the subject. Okay. So, they want to bring up Bitcoin's negative externalities, and they don't want to talk about its positive, the things it does for the world. Okay. Well, what about the petrodollar? Are we just not gonna talk about the negative externalities? I just picked up this book, which, by the way, I mean, who knows how good it is, but it was buried. I mean, it's like, you have to find it. Like, so this was written right after the invasion of Iraq, right? Which I mentioned earlier. I mean, one of the obvious reasons that we invaded Iraq is that the dictator there, who of course was horrible, decided to try and sell oil for a different currency than the dollar. I mean, and obviously one of the reasons we're in the Middle East, waist deep and supporting murderous dictators like MBS in Saudi Arabia, is that we're trying to protect the petrodollar. I mean, this is really clear and obvious, and you can even kind of hear it when you read President Biden's remarks about why he didn't go after MBS. It would be too costly. Okay, so we're trying to preserve this system, and it is just this. Yeah, it's this huge double standard of the media, really focusing and drilling in on Bitcoin because it's new, and really like beating the crap out of it. I mean, if you really look at the headlines over the last 10 years, it's not just a story. What they do is, when I was doing the research on the Wired piece, they would take this story about energy or about criminals, okay? And then they would first of all, they would share it like many times, like within 2 weeks, just like hammering their audience with it. And then a year later, they would bring the same story back and not tell you it's like from the archives, and they would hammer it again over and over again. So again, there's no like conspiracy. I mean, there's no one person pulling the strings, but it is a big gaslighting operation. It's just sad because it's done by human nature and it's not done by some shadowy actor. There's no like person conspiring to like, try to prevent people from understanding Bitcoin. It's in all of our human nature that we are to be skeptical of these new things, right? So look, the sooner that folks can learn about what's actually happening, the better. The more that they can improve their own lives and also those around them. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, and this interview, my goal is that this is also a piece of a documentation why Bitcoin is important and what it can do and what it already has done. So I would like you to talk a little bit about like the numbers.
Sure.
How many people around the world don't have access to money, etc. You know what I mean.
Yeah. So when I think about Bitcoin as a tool that people use, I think about two different categories. I think about a savings instrument, and I think about an unstoppable payments network. And if we think about the first one, savings instrument, 1.2 billion people live under double or triple digit inflation. So, they are constantly thinking about their earnings, their wages. A lot of these people come from countries that have a really, really big public sector. So a lot of people just, they work for the government. And the wages that they earn, they have nowhere to like put them. It's like a bucket that has holes in it, right? And they can literally see their hard-earned time evaporating, especially in countries like Sudan or Syria or Lebanon or Venezuela or Zimbabwe, where the inflation is hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of percent. But even in whether it's Turkey or Nigeria, I mean, these are huge countries with hundreds of millions of people, 200 million in Nigeria, 100 million almost in Turkey. You got 15% inflation. I mean, if you think about the second order effects of that, I mean, it's crazy. So, and that's just the official inflation, right? So in America, we have whatever it is, 2%, but we know that things get a lot more expensive in areas that the government doesn't count. Well, think about what's happening over there, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine. So, Bitcoin comes in and is this permissionless savings instrument that's open to everybody. Again, quality of opportunity. You just need internet access. You can start converting your wages or your whatever you have, whatever amount you have. I mean, if you're cautious and you take this seriously, you can open an on-chain transaction on a weekend if you're receiving a paycheck. And the fee is less than $1 right now. And then my general thought is, as those fees, of course, if you want it immediately, it's $15 or $10 or whatever it ends up being. It varies a lot, actually, depending on the time of day right now. But I do think that those on-chain fees are eventually going to get very expensive. But that's really where Lightning Network comes into play. And it's the dream that those folks are building is that you won't have to settle on chain. You'll just be born into Lightning and you'll operate from there. And there's ways to do that non-custodially, which is very cool. But the point is that you'll be able to, with regard whatever amount of money you have. I mean, Bitcoin does not promise any sort of like a redistributionist like wealth inequality solution. That is not what's happening here. This is just it's the changing of the guard of the type of money. It does not mean that all of a sudden we're not going to have wealthy people or poor people. It's going to preserve most likely the existing structure in many ways. The key difference is that the money can't be manipulated. So a lot of people who are very rich, they got there by manipulating the money. So that won't happen. That doesn't happen in a Bitcoin system. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to discuss around the savings aspect of this, the way it's debasement proof, right? But ultimately, hundreds of millions of people around the world, when they save, they do it in sheet metal or cows. You have to understand that. They can't even find greenbacks, American dollars often. So they are having a hard time preserving their time and energy. And Bitcoin gives them a much better option. So that's number one. The second thing is the unstoppable payments network. Here's where you need to understand that 4.3 billion people live under authoritarian regimes. That's more than half the world. So these are countries where you don't have property rights. You don't have free speech. Oftentimes, even being a part of a human rights organization is illegal. So if you look at a country like China or Turkey or whatever, I mean, they're arresting people who even just disagree with the government. I mean, in Turkey, they've arrested tens of thousands of lawyers, judges, journalists, academics. I mean, people who just disagree with the government, right? So, in these places, being able to be sovereign over your bank account and being able to receive payments and send them without the interference of the government is a very big leap forward. Very, very big. And, I think it's fair to say that the world has not understood that yet, but it is massive. I mean, massive. I mean, it just takes that power away from the regime. And it's just one tool, but it's a pretty important tool. I mean, if all of a sudden they can't control the banking system anymore, I mean, that really puts a check on what they can do, right? So whether it's as a saving instrument or as an unstoppable payment rail, and the latter, of course, has important implications for remittances, for example, which are extortionate, or people fleeing violence or repression. I mean, I've interviewed people who've left Syria, Venezuela, who've been able to rely on Bitcoin either to bring money out or send money back. So that unstoppable payment rail use case is huge. So you've got those two. There's going to be more, and there are more, but those are the two big ones that I like to think about when I unpack why is Bitcoin valuable, right? Like why is it not a waste of energy, right?
Yeah, and there's also the idea of that Bitcoin basically is a human right in that sense that it's like freedom of transaction, like freedom of speech is a human right.
Yeah.
Because basically you're exchanging value in form of mathematical language, you might say.
Yeah, in America, at least, it's sort of like First and Fourth Amendment, right? It's like free speech and private property, kind of a mix, right? But yeah, the freedom to transact. I don't know if it's I'm not a huge fan of like is this a human right or is that a human right thing? Because then it leads us down the road to like, well, is access to the internet a human right? Is having Bitcoin a human right? And I just think those conversations aren't very productive. It's better for me to, I think we should focus on these negative rights, like what should not the government be able to do? Well, censor, right? Great. So they shouldn't be able to censor our speech or our transactions. This is what I believe, at least. So I know some people disagree, but
I heard in many countries that women still are not allowed to get an inheritance, and so they also don't have securities to get a loan. Do you have any examples, or how do you think that Bitcoin can empower women all over the world?
Yeah, well, I'll give you two examples. And again, we're very early. So I would caution people. I think people need to understand that, first of all, a lot of people who've benefited from Bitcoin are not going to tell the world about it. Like, it's a private thing, the finances. Like, the majority of the stories and the majority of the impact Bitcoin has had is not something that's going to be in the news. Like, these aren't going to be people who are ready to go to the New York Times. They don't want to go to the New York Times, like, for a good reason. But I think it would be foolish to overlook what has happened and what continues to happen. I'll give you two examples. One is incredible, actually. I got to know a Afghan entrepreneur, I think back in maybe 14 or 15. Her name's Roya Mahbub, and she was, I think, Afghanistan's first female technology CEO. And I got to know her because of her work bringing internet and internet access to young women in Afghanistan. And she later became well known. She's a Time 100, and Sheryl Sandberg wrote her profile, and she got very well known when she was She was basically the patron of the Afghan girls robotics team, which was quite popular it continues to be an amazing group of young women. But I didn't really know about Roya. I'd known her for years before. Like, I was just with her at a conference once, and I was talking to her, and I mentioned Bitcoin, and she was like very deep. Like, and I learned about this incredible story about how in 2013, in the run up to the bubble, she converted her company entirely to Bitcoin, and she was paying all of her employees in Bitcoin. I guess in Afghanistan at the time, a lot of the women that worked for her doing software stuff, they had phones, they just didn't have a bank account, and she didn't want to give them cash because their male family members would take it, etc. So this gave them that like sense of financial freedom. It's pretty cool. Now, it's interesting because then there was the huge crash, and she had to make everybody whole, and it was a big setback mentally. But a lot of the women they were like, I'm keeping it. I don't care that it fell in value against the dollar. And a lot of them still have it. And a lot of them used it. And in fact, she told me this one story of a woman who used the money that she earned from Roya in Bitcoin, and then she had to leave Afghanistan because of political violence threats. So she was a refugee, and she went through this harrowing journey through Iran and Turkey by foot, by train, by boat. Made it to Germany, actually, where she lives now, and she was able to use the Bitcoin, and she cashed out. I think this was in 2017 to help start a new life, and I thought that was pretty amazing. So I think that's really big. I mean, what you learn from stories like that is that obviously Bitcoin cannot discriminate. Like, it's for everybody. It literally does not know what your gender is, and that's like one of its biggest perks. The other example I'll mention is just the Feminist Coalition in Nigeria. Obviously, FEMCO was having issues with their fintech apps and bank accounts in October when they were some of the leaders and organizers of these like protests, anti-SARS protests in Nigeria against police brutality and lack of accountability, corruption, and they started to raise money in Bitcoin, which was cool, and they raised about almost 8 Bitcoin actually. So and they used it to spend on protest equipment and other things like that. There's a whole accounting of it online. They were very transparent and very inspiring. So I would say those are 2 pretty strong examples, but there's many more that haven't been told,
Yeah, funny that you say that, because I made an interview with the Feminist Coalition and also with Feminist Forum from Afghanistan.
Yeah,
maybe you know her. She's also she organized also a school for women in Afghanistan to learn how to code and stuff.
Yeah, I think she was involved with Roya early on, and they've ended up splitting and doing 2 different things. But yes, 2 similar examples, absolutely. But there's more. Think about it this way. Like, one of the biggest hallmarks of the Belarusian democracy movement is that it's like women-led, right? So you have the leader is a woman, Svetlana, and the leader of her campaign is a woman, and the leader of the party is a woman, and oftentimes when you watch the protests, they're led by women. So it's really, really cool. And, a lot of the support that's been pouring into Belarus, I think it's over 200 Bitcoin now that have been sent into Belarus since last summer. It was over 175 by the end of February. So, we'll see where we are now. My guess is around 200 Bitcoin have been sent peer-to-peer to people inside Belarus. And, more than half, I believe, roughly, or about half, more than half, are women, obviously, who are receiving the Bitcoin, spending it. So I think that's very worth noting as well, is Bitcoin's role in that movement.
And as we said before, I also think that many people really don't want to talk about it because they also fear repression from their authorities. I've been to Zimbabwe, and I interviewed a guy who is using Bitcoin to be paid from abroad. And we were in a restaurant, and I was interviewing him. And after 20 minutes, one of the ladies came and told us we are not allowed to do an interview here. She didn't know what we are talking about.
Yeah.
But alone the fact that you can't sit in a restaurant and do an interview, for me, this is completely new, of course. Yeah. So no wonder that people don't talk about if and how they use Bitcoin.
Yeah. Again, just to caution people, just because there's not that many stories that you've read doesn't mean it's not happening. There's a good reason for people wanting to keep innovations in personal finance, close to the vest, especially in some of these environments, right?
Just yesterday, I saw, I researched again how the situation with Bitcoin in Zimbabwe is. And last year, when I went there, I didn't find any online sites or current events about it. And yesterday, I realized that there are now podcasts with Zimbabweans who speak about cryptocurrencies and blockchain, which I find interesting because it seems that it's growing. It's becoming more. What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah. No. On that topic specifically, I will say my general impression is that, and we've worked with Zimbabwean human rights activists for more than 10 years, and in speaking to them, and my organization did a human rights event in Joburg 3 years ago. So I've been there several times speaking, talking about Bitcoin. But also we did a human rights event in Joburg, and we had quite a few Zimbabwean activists there who came over for the event. And I will say that it's similar to the rest of the human rights community. They didn't really get it yet, and they still are grappling with it. And also recently I interviewed someone who's a Zimbabwean journalist who covers the money markets, and he covers FX and stuff like that. And even he was he didn't get it yet. He was nah, it's a Ponzi scheme, So I think just the lack of education, it's just going to take time. As you're mentioning, the unfortunate thing is in a lot of societies, including my own, like in Silicon Valley, people get scammed by these like other like altcoin projects or whatever. And it happens in Silicon Valley, it happens in Zimbabwe, it happens in Egypt, it happens in China, everywhere. So, but it's especially bad when it's like exploitative, right? And that's really like, so South Africa obviously dominates the media and news, even in Zimbabwe, right? Like big, like famous people there, trends, things like that. Everything's sort of connected, right? And unfortunately, South Africa had a lot of like, I mean, it was a lot of the whole blockchain, not Bitcoin, like a lot of these ICOs. It was a bad scene. I mean, from what I saw, at least, a very bad scene. I mean, nobody was talking about Bitcoin. Nobody was talking about Bitcoin. And that was like in 2018. So, I mean, it was rough. I mean, there were a lot of scams. So I can only imagine how bad it was and how many people got burned in Zimbabwe. So, you know, it's kind of like really unfortunate. But the fact is that in a lot of societies, people haven't put two and two together yet because they've been burned by like some sort of MLM or some sort of Ponzi or ICO. And at the same time, like the, you know, the human rights kind of community just hasn't really thought about it yet. So, you know, it just takes time. I mean, you can't force it. I mean, we can be helpful. We can, you know, get educational materials. We can do talks. Like, I'm pretty open. If people, you know, people get in touch with me, I help them. But like, you can't force Bitcoin. You know what I mean? And you shouldn't. Like, it just does its thing. Like, I want to help people, but they have to want it, you know? Otherwise it doesn't work. I mean, Bitcoin is a voluntary phenomenon. Is really the end of the, you know, at the end of the day, it's what it is. You can't live with regret about that. You could be like, oh, I wish I could have, like, you know, told more people in X country in 2017 or 16 or 15 or whatever. You could live with regret your whole life thinking that way. But the fact is, it didn't happen. They weren't ready for it. They didn't want it. You know, it's voluntary, you know?
Yeah, which is a good thing. But in that case, yeah, you're right. I also had this impression that they don't really get it, and nobody was talking about Bitcoin. It is always just blockchain and cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, and that's that's the big thing is that you continue to get that. The obvious red flag when you speak to somebody is they talk about crypto, and that means they don't know what they're talking about. And it's like, okay, well, then you're like, well, what crypto? What do you mean? And like, you know, it's sad and depressing, but it is what it is. And you know, we're just not there yet. But you're right. Like, when I speak to a lot of people in contexts like that, they haven't gotten it. And it's partly because of the media thing, like the gaslighting. It's partly because of that. It's partly because it's just new and very different and hard to understand. So again, we'll chip away over time. But it's, yeah, I just did an interview with two South African podcasters in the last month, and they were both saying how just sort of prevalent the scams were there. So it's a mountain to climb. I don't know what to say.
What do you think, which regions in the world are, how should I say, on the one hand, a focus because of a bad human rights situation, and on the other hand, are very far in their Bitcoin adoption? I think Nigeria would be a place.
Yeah, look, it's so hard to get data on this, but clearly there's like millions of people using Bitcoin in Nigeria, Turkey, and Argentina, and China. I mean, those are 4 good examples of people who use Bitcoin either to get around capital controls or have like a sovereign savings account that they control. Not that's, you know, confiscation resistant, devaluation resistant. So I think those are countries worth mentioning. But there's huge Bitcoin use in many large countries. I mean, Pakistan, India. I mean, if you look at the top, someone just did yesterday like a listing of the top like crypto related websites in the world, starting with Binance all the way down. So WazirX, like the big Indian exchange, is like top 10. There's just so many Indian Bitcoiners. there was an interview the other day, and it was crazy. I mean, the big exchanges are estimating that there's like 6 million hodlers, like that there's way more people, but a lot of them trade and stuff. But like there's just 6 million people hodling, which is pretty nuts if you think about the role gold historically plays in a society like India. I mean, Bitcoin's going to have a massive impact. The Philippines is another 100 million person country with a lot of big. I mean, there's like brick and mortar stores all over the Philippines where you can go and receive your remittance from your family abroad, or even yourself abroad, you know, from a different account via Bitcoin into local cash. Like there's, I mean, all over Latin America. I mean, it's happening everywhere. And I think it's like, again, this is like, it's an everywhere phenomenon. Like in America, you know, we have a lot of human rights issues too, and a lot of issues with different populations, and, you know, being cut off from financial services. And there's a lot of people just doing work here in my country, helping people onto Bitcoin. I mean, if you look at the work of like Isaiah Jackson, for example, etc., there's a lot of work to be done everywhere. So I think it's kind of an everywhere phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are so many human rights issues all around the world. What are the small successes for you that keep you going?
Yeah, well, I mean, just the very nature of it is obvious to me and is very inspiring. And I have a piece coming out this week on this, but I really think that Bitcoin is this like Trojan horse for freedom, like in that, you know, it looks very appealing to a wide variety of people. I mean, eventually to everybody. It's glittering. It's like this digital gold thing, and it attracts so many different kinds of actors, like corporations, or you know, even I think sovereign wealth funds. We're starting to get into that area. Professional investors, people who like literally don't care about human rights or are anti-human rights, like, but they're going to be forced to buy this thing and like start strengthening its global network effects, and then you have like more developers and more miners and better UX and better network security. They don't care about the cypherpunk aspect. They don't care about what it does for people, but they don't need to care. So like Bitcoin doesn't run on altruism or some like grand humanitarian ambition. Who cares? It runs on self-preservation, greed, self-interest, what have you, profit-seeking, whatever you want to call it. Like, but like as people get involved because of this glittering-looking Trojan horse that they want, and it'll deliver the riches, but like what they don't realize is what's inside, right? So that's what animates me, is that I can see that there's this game theory that's unstoppable. That's really, really refreshing, because in the human rights community, it's very difficult to raise money, and people we're low on altruism. I mean, look at the freaking sponsors for the Genocide Olympics in 2022 in Beijing. You can go on that website. It's like every household corporation from Airbnb on down. They don't care. I mean, you can look at the membership of the UN Human Rights Council or the FATF. It's all these dictators. Nobody cares. There's all kinds of people from Ray Dalio all on down who went to the Davos in the desert in Saudi. They don't care about human rights. So the world is like, we're short on actual consideration. And even the people who say these pretty words, I mean, it's often just discarded. But with Bitcoin, we don't have to care about their intentions. They don't matter. Like, because they're going to get involved, because they're going to have to get involved, they're going to strengthen a freedom tool, which is very, very exciting. So that's what I'm thinking most about lately. But yeah, I mean, I've done dozens of interviews with people around the world. I mean, there's a guy who I've interviewed in Sudan. I mean, Sudan had a crushing dictatorship for decades and had crushing numerous complete kind of currency devaluations. And this person had no hope at all at the end of 2009-10, just none. And then over the last decade, this person, he ended up leaving Sudan to work in Ireland and to send money back to his family, right? He still goes and stuff, but he's really inspired now because of two things. One, of course, the political transformation. They somehow got rid of Bashir, and that's not perfect, but the country's moving in a better direction there. And then at the same time, he discovered Bitcoin, and he's been using it, and like they've been able to avoid the debasements that continue to happen. So that was a very inspiring story, and there's just many people like him. You know, they're just not telling their story all the time. But I was very, very fired up by that one in particular.
Yeah, Bitcoin is a reason for a little bit of optimism.
Totally.
what would you like to say to our listeners, like a message, maybe about what we said before, like what the mainstream media does overlook? What do people need to know about Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, I think something that's worth considering is a lot of people are afraid of this sort of, whether it's like Big Brother or surveillance capitalism. Your listeners, whether you're in Germany or France or United States or etc., we may not be worried about massive currency devaluation or bank account confiscation. We may live in a bubble, a small bubble, by the way. Only like 13% of humans live in a country that has a liberal democracy and a reserve currency. But we are also, whether you want to debate it or not, very influential. We steer a lot of what happens to the rest of the world, right? And I think there is this growing concern about privacy. And I think people need to understand just how important Bitcoin is going to be for that. I mean, we have this opportunity to move into an economy and into an artist, audience, sort of creator system, and into a writer or journalist and audience system where you can stream payments, you can receive funds from your audience in a way that's censorship resistant and basically anonymous. If you think about the way that Lightning works, it's pretty exciting. So I'm very fired up by this idea of like where are we going to go with Lightning? How's it going to work? Like, it's cool to see all these exchanges adopting it. Obviously, they're adopting it again with the Trojan horse. They're adopting it to save on fees. They don't care about privacy. But there's a lot of this game theory here where like Bitcoin forces people who don't care about freedom and privacy to improve it. It like forces their hand, right? It tricks them. And we're continuing to see that because Lightning, I don't think it gets to where it's going to go without the base layer fee getting really high. Like at the end of the day, we can do as much as we can promoting it, talking about it, building on it, making cool apps and wallets, but the demand's just not going to be there until people are forced to. People are lazy, right? They just want to do on-chain, but they're going to be forced to use it. And like, I'm really grateful that it's there. And then it comes with all these other benefits, obviously, like global final settlement, instant payments. It's more private. It's not on the chain, so chain analysis companies can't spy on your behavior. It's a lot of cool stuff involved there. So I would say take a look at that, and if you're concerned about creeping surveillance into your life, maybe Bitcoin is worth looking into. I think it's quite important, regardless of where you live. But yeah, that's my final thought, I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much for that thought. And before we go, I want to recommend this little book here, the little Bitcoin book. You are co-author.
Yes.
It's a very interesting and good introduction to Bitcoin.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if you go to thelittlebitcoinbook.com, we have it free as a PDF in many languages: Mandarin, Arabic, Uyghur, which I'm very, very excited about, Farsi. It's up there in Korean, Punjab, Hindi, etc. So we're continuing to pump out the translations, but we're excited to get that book into the hands of as many people as possible.
That's fantastic. I will put it in the show notes. So thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for your time, and have a good day.
Thank you, Anita. Take care.
Thanks so much for joining the Anita Posch Show today to learn more about Bitcoin. You can find the show notes for this conversation on anita.link/show. If you want to get the best stories in Bitcoin from my point of view in your mailbox, go to anita.link/weekly and subscribe. And if you have a question or just want to send me some feedback, drop me a line at hello@anitaposch.com. See you next week when it's time for the Anita Posch Show. Music, start with yes, delicate beats. Content, idea and production, Anita Posch.